Oakland Heights. Oregon, a defunct suburb of Portland, was known for its lavish charm and wealthy vibe. But beneath the surface, the area hides a secret that makes even the most skeptic shiver. A place that was so mysterious it was forgotten by time, and was only a whisper or a rumor, called the Starlight West Theater, a notorious nightclub known for its peculiar shows and even more peculiar owner, George Stanley. To him, the theater was like a siren's call to those who sought the unusual, a place where reality and myth blurred together into a haunting melody that was both enchanting and disturbing. Today, the alleyway on a certain street, the nightclub's facade, was nondescript, hidden behind a bookstore. The only hint of its existence was a small, tarnished brass star that gleamed in the moonlight. The door was unassuming, but it led to a world that was anything but ordinary, as the foyer was dimly lit, with velvet drapes that swallowed the light and filled the air with a faint scent of roses and decay, creating an atmosphere that was both seductive and eerie. The main stage, adorned with intricate Art Deco designs, was where the heart of the Starlight West beat, pumping out a dark and mesmerizing rhythm that drew in its audience night after night. The performers, with their glinting eyes and unearthly grace, danced and sang as if under a spell, their movements eerily synchronized to the haunting melodies that played. In the 1960s, the star of the show, Evelyn Klein, was an ethereal beauty whose very presence on stage seemed to cast a shadow of sadness and fear over the room. Her voice tried to hide, captivating all who heard it, leaving them with a disturbing sense of unease that lingered long after the audience left and the theater went silent. But it was in the early 1970s that the Starlight West and its dark secrets began to unfurl, when Evelyn's performances grew less than predictable. On October 9, 1973, Evelyn Klein was reported missing, and the local papers had a field day, printing salacious headlines that spoke of love triangles, secret affairs, and the use of narcotics. Starlight West Theater became the epicenter of a media frenzy that painted the theater in a sinister light. Despite the increased publicity, George Stanley remained tight-lipped, the creases around his eyes deepening as the days turned into weeks without any sign of his star performer. Over the next few days, other performers started doing their skits and comedy shows that were lackluster and only entertaining to those who had seen them 100 times, as the atmosphere at the Starlight West was thick with tension, and whispers of Evelyn's disappearance filled the air like a heavy fog, and the formerly vibrant and energetic space now felt eerie and lifeless. The vibrant colors of the velvet curtains seemed to have faded into a sad, mourning shade, and the rhythm of the city had changed, and so had the theater, the heart of which had gone missing. However, the local mafia families, such as the Castellanos, had their eyes on the Starlight West for reasons beyond the macabre. The theater was a gold mine for laundering money and smuggling contraband. With Evelyn's disappearance, George and his usual sharp instincts had grown dull with grief, making the theater vulnerable to their advances, and the ruthless for this criminal enterprise enforcer named Richie DeLuca was known for his charm, and cunning had taken an interest in the place and its enigmatic owner. Oakland Heights, that was about 30 miles away from the hustle and bustle of Portland, had its quiet charm, with its tree-lined streets and quaint little shops that had a life of their own. But tonight was different. There was an unsettling stillness that hung in the air like a shroud. The Starlight West Theater stood like a silent sentinel. The heart of the former suburb is abandoned today, the whispers of its past long silenced by the march of time. Then on June 18th, 1995, some local boys who graduated from high school decided to take a road trip toward the now dilapidated remains of the proud neighborhood, now laid in disrepair as buildings crumbled and were graffitied. They had heard the stories about the Starlight West Theater and the legend of Evelyn Klein. They were curious and decided to explore the abandoned theater. The place was overgrown with ivy and the windows were shattered, but the brass star still hung above the door, a sad reminder of its former glory. The boys, armed with pocket knives, crowbars, and a camcorder, embarked on a journey into Oakland Heights, confronted with the sight of urban decay and forgotten dreams, with broken glass nearly covering the streets, and hollowed buildings stripped of their former charm. They pushed through the ivy and made their way into the Starlight West Theater, and the velvet drapes hung in tatters, the carpeting now threadbare and stained with the detritus of years of neglect. Lingering scent of decay and death filled their nostrils with fear as they ventured into the sinister building. As they recorded their accounts, Then suddenly one of the boys pointed at the corner of the stage, where a spotlight pierced the gloom, revealing a dusty grand piano, its ivory keys yellowed with age, and the instrument seemed to hum with an eerie resonance, as if it remembered the days when it was the center of the theater's mystical allure. The boys approached cautiously, their footsteps echoing through the cavernous space, and one of them sat down and tentatively played a few notes, casting an eerie and haunting sound, along with a moaning of pain as well as suffering. Around 5:30 p.m., one of them shouted as they found a staircase hidden behind the curtains, leading down to a basement. Their flashlights flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The stench grew stronger, the air thick with the scent of decay when the boys descended. Their demeanor started to turn fearful as the stairs creaked under their weight, the sound echoing through the theater like a mournful cry. Later, the footage picked up a pair of glowing red eyes peeking through the shadows, and the sound of shuffling feet, the kind that seemed to belong to something that didn't quite walk like a human, grew louder as they ventured deeper into the basement, as the boys and their laughter from being too scared had turned into hushed whispers and nervous glances over their shoulders, their bravado of earlier replaced by a creeping sense of dread. The red eyes, unbeknownst to them at the time, started following their every move. The source of the eyes remained hidden, but the feeling of being watched grew palpable as they navigated through the cluttered basement, filled with forgotten props and costumes from decades past. The air grew colder, a chill that seemed to penetrate their very bones, and the basement was a labyrinth of memories and secrets, each step taking them further from the safety of the world above. Then suddenly one of them picked up a sound of growling that made them freeze in their tracks, their flashlights shaking as they pointed them into the darkness ahead, the beams illuminating a set of yellowed fangs snarling from the shadows of a discarded prop, their hearts racing. They realized it was a costume, a lifelike werewolf mask that once terrified audiences, but now was a mere relic of a forgotten horror. They laughed nervously and continued their exploration. The basement walls were lined with dusty, forgotten photographs of past performances, the faces of the performers frozen in time, their expressions a mix of joy and terror that seemed to follow the boys as they moved deeper into the bowels of the theater, their whispers bouncing off the cold concrete walls and the glow from their flashlights dancing across the cracked and peeling wallpaper as the camcorder picked up an orb that was hovering with malevolence that was found later on the tape. In the corner of the basement, a single light bulb flickered ominously, casting an erratic pattern of shadows on the floor, revealing a heavy metal door that stood out against the decay. It was not old, and it had a padlock that looked untouched. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up as they approached it, their curiosity now overwhelming their fear, changed nervous glances, the camcorder zooming in to capture the moment. The air was thick with anticipation and dread. However, knowing that there was power still on, they decided to charge their camcorder and phones, hoping that the outlet worked and wouldn't short-circuit. They found an extension cord hanging from the ceiling and plugged it in. The light bulb above them buzzed louder for a moment before steadying, and the camcorder's screen flickered to life, the battery icon showing a full charge. The sudden burst of brightness from the camcorder screen was a stark contrast to darkness that surrounded them, and it was in this light that they noticed after reviewing the footage later. But for now, the boys were too caught up in their quest to pay much attention to the subtle cues of impending danger with the newfound courage. They approached the metal door, the padlock giving way with a satisfying click under the pressure of the crowbar. Suddenly, the camcorder picked up a whisper, faint and distant, a sound that seemed to resonate from the very walls of the theater, and their laughter died in their throats as they turned to face the open door, their flashlights sweeping the dusty floor, searching for the source of the sound. But the basement remained eerily silent, the only noise the steady drip of water from a leaky pipe somewhere in the darkness. When the camcorder was finally charged, they continued their harrowing journey into the unknown, the whispers of the past seemingly muffled by the thick dust that coated the air. As they pushed open the metal door, it creaked on its hinges like the opening of a crypt that has been sealed off from the outside world for decades. The room was small, but what it lacked in size, it made up for in its macabre decor, with walls lined with shelves filled with jars of murky liquid and unidentifiable objects floating within, a sight that sent shivers down their spines. The centerpiece of the room was a terrifying and hideous chair with leather straps that looked as though they had been used to restrain someone or something. The chair was stained with what looked like dried blood, and the very air in the room felt charged with a sense of horror and despair, the kind that lingers long after the screams have stopped. The boys took a step back, their flashlights flickering as the reality of what they had stumbled upon began to sink in, and knew this was used by the mafia for something terrible such as torture and eventually murder, sending shivers down their spines, shaking the camcorder. Then suddenly a huge scream came from the corner of the room, making the boys jump and scream in horror, their flashlights swiveling wildly to find the source of the disturbance. A pale figure of a woman slowly stepped forward, dressed in a faded dress dripping with blood and viscera limping, her way towards the young men pointing her finger. And they knew it was Ýᴏᴜ Klein who disappeared all those years ago, the star of the show now a twisted form. She let out a guttural moan, her eyes glowing with rage as she approached them, her movements jerky and unnatural, making the boys stumble backward, tripping over debris and slipping on the slick floor, their eyes glued to the terrifying specter that was once a beautiful woman. And the camcorder fell from the hand of the one filming, its light rolling away and casting wild, erratic shadows across the room as it hit the ground until one of them picked it back up and started recording. Then her raspy and choking voice said what sounded like, "Tell my story," as she glided through the air straight at them. The boys realized that the figure of Ýᴏᴜ Klein was no mere illusion, but a vengeful spirit trapped in the theater by a terrible fate. The years of anger and pain had twisted her into something monstrous and vengeful, and one of the young men shouted, "How? Nobody will believe us." Ýᴏᴜ replied, "In the cabinet," before disappearing into the darkness, leaving the room feeling colder than before. The boys frantically searched the cabinet and found a hidden compartment with papers, later revealed to be a contract that bound Ýᴏᴜ to the club, and the only way into fine print was either by forfeiture of her assets, accidental death by illness, or tragedy sending chills down their spines. They knew they had stumbled upon something significant, something that could unravel the mystery of the Starlight West Theater and its tragic past. Then there was a map with a circle on a lake that was located near Portland, Oregon, nicknamed Concrete Lake by the locals after the people who were murdered by the mafia and dumped into it in the 1950s until the 1970s when the murders stopped. The map had notes scribbled in the margins that spoke of rituals and sacrifices, hinting at a darker purpose behind Ýᴏᴜ's disappearance than anyone could have ever imagined. The boys felt a heavy weight on their chests, the gravity of their discovery sinking in. After their ordeal, they took everything to the Portland Police Department, and an investigation was opened about several missing people were found now. Skeletons at this point, all of which had connections to the Starlight West Theater and the Castellanos Mafia. George Stanley was found living in a rundown apartment, a mere shadow of his former self, haunted by the ghosts of his past and the dark secrets he had been forced to keep. However, the most horrific discovery happened in an old fishing shack as the mummified remains of a woman, dressed in a tattered, stained dress that matched the one seen in the theater, were pulled out from the murky waters of Concrete Lake as the boys watched from a safe distance as the news vans descended upon the area, the flashing lights casting an eerie glow across the water's surface, and their hearts sank as the reality of their adventure turned into a grim revelation of past atrocities. Later it was revealed the mummified body belonged to Ýᴏᴜ Klein. She was tortured, starved, and beaten to death because of wanting to get away from George Stanley. It took dental records to determine it was her body, and her spirit now at peace with the truth coming to light. The Starlight West Theater turned into a memorial for the victims of the mafia's influence over the area dwindled, and they arrested George Stanley, who was in his late 70s at the time, and was charged with aiding and abetting in the murder of Ýᴏᴜ Klein. He confessed to knowing about the dark dealings, but claimed he was under threat from the Castellanos family. Today, the former Oakland Heights was bulldozed, and the Starlight West Theater was renovated under a new name that was not disclosed to the public. The new owners claimed they were going to turn it into a museum dedicated to the history of the area, but the locals knew better. They knew that you couldn't erase the stain of darkness that clung to that place. The whispers of the past would always linger. I knew it was him from the cologne. It was always the cheap mall kiosk stuff. He swore you couldn't tell the difference. I never had the heart to tell him he was wrong. It was about 3 in the morning when I felt him get into bed with me. The king we used to share felt empty without him. I felt the bed shift. I felt someone nuzzle up close to me. I swear I heard him whisper into my ear. "Hey, baby," he cooed. "I'm here now." I rolled over to kiss him. I needed this. Of course, there was nobody there. Jack had died 3 months ago in this apartment of a drug overdose. We met in our early 20s, me being a fresh young gay on Grindr, newly out of the closet and wondering why so many people wanted to party. Enter Jack. Someone who had spent his time and left said party. He was more versed than me in life experience by a mile. Homeless at 16 by parents who wouldn't accept him, Jack fell into what most kicked-out gays do, a life of drugs and alcohol. He grew up fast, grew up hard, and was exposed to things a kid his age shouldn't have been. I'm not making excuses. He made a lot of bad choices too. A jail stint and court-ordered rehab set him straight. Thankfully, things were good, or so I had thought. 6 months ago, I noticed changes in him. He was run down, tired. He repeatedly said he couldn't sleep and had nightmares. I thought he was overworked. He had found himself a great construction gig and was fond of overtime. It helped keep his head on straight, he'd say. 3 months ago, I came back to our apartment to find him slouched over on our couch. His face was contorted into a scene of painful shock. I panicked. I don't know what happened next. My memories just flash a bit, like a slideshow after this. 911 was called. The doctors and coroners were stumped. All signs point to a heart attack. I overheard one EMT say sourly after I divulged Jack's drug history that the drug use finally caught up with him. True or not, I almost punched her in the face. Time stopped for me after that for a while. I had to put on the funeral. It was a lot for me. I felt like I was covered in molasses. I don't remember how it went. I think it was a small turnout, mostly co-workers, all very sympathetic, of course. I can't remember much of that first month. I was too deep in my grief. I was struck with a fever twice. I could barely get out of bed. I'm sure it was a combination of the depression as well. That month was brutal. I couldn't find a reason to get out of bed most days. I started snapping out of it when the noises started. Bumps in the middle night, shuffling, doors closing and opening, footsteps. I wasn't sleeping most nights. I couldn't. The noises occurred with too much frequency to give me a respite. I thought I was going crazy until the night the bathroom faucet turned on. I shuffled out of the bed, groggy and half asleep. I got to the closed bathroom door and tried to open it. Locked. The light was on, and something was casting a shadow. I knock. Clear as day. I hear Jack's voice. "Hold on, babe. I'm almost done." I slam the door open. His toothbrush falls from midair to the ground. The sink turns off. There's a large thump behind me. I didn't sleep that night. Noises continued. Whispers. A few nights later is when he climbs into bed with me. I haven't told anyone about that yet. What would they say? It's grief. It will pass. You still feel him around you. I didn't want to hear that bullshit. I knew what I felt. He was in bed with me. The dreams came next, and that should have been my first warning in retrospect. They were so beautiful. Could you fault me? Put yourself in my shoes. They started out as memories of the good times he and I had together. The first date at a bowling alley. The first kiss at the drive-in theater. The times he knew I would hold dear to me. They were incredibly vivid. Then, he started addressing me. First briefly, not much. Just vague feelings or concepts of conversations we had in those memories. Talking about the tiny things you never knew you'd miss talking about, like corn dogs from a county fair. I wasn't sure whether or not those conversations happened. They were always foggy memories of the best times, but they got increasingly more and more specific. Sleep got worse. If it wasn't Jack visiting my dreams, it was the noises he'd create at night. I began to feel ill again. One night, he came to me in a dream. He took my hand, looked me in the eye, and began to cry. "God, I've missed you," he sobbed. It was the first time he seemed to acknowledge what happened. He leaned in, kissed me gently on the lips. He hugged me, and that cheap familiar cologne scent filled my nostrils. I felt a tear go down my cheek. I missed this. He leaned closed, and I felt his breath in my ear as he whispered the words that snapped me awake. "You should come with me." I woke up in a cold sweat. I could taste his lips on mine. The words and implications still lingered in my mind. I loved him. I was young and naive, sure, but he was my first. You remember that kind of love? Right. I know now that life goes on. But during that time, for reasons I find out later, his words grabbed me. What was so good about being without him anyway? The noises persisted. He kept visiting, asking again for me to join him. The request getting heavier and heavier to ignore. I wanted to ask about what he meant, but I couldn't. Or I guess didn't need to. I knew what it meant. I didn't want to admit it to myself at the time that it was a possibility. I barely slept. When I did, I wasn't rested. I felt like the Walking Dead already. Is that why I'm seeing Jack everywhere? I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't want to hear their conventional wisdom bullshit about grief. The thing that concerned me the most was the sleepwalking. I never did it in the 32 years of my life. And suddenly it starts when my dead boyfriend decides to visit. Go figure. I'd wake up in precarious positions, never in deadly danger, but just enough where a wrong turn or a fall would break an arm. Things escalated one night. I would have died had it not been for gravy. Jack was in my dreams again. Where we're at the county fair. We were holding hands and staring dumbfounded in different ways at the rides put up the night before. Jack had always loved them. I think it helped speak to a bit of the risk-taker in him. He loved theme parks and roller coasters to death. I wouldn't dare. I was a notorious scaredy cat. He asked me why I wasn't smiling like I used to. He knew the answer. I know you're tired and scared, he said, rubbing my hand with both of his. But I need you to answer soon. I don't know much longer I can visit like this. It didn't occur to me that he may be doing this on borrowed time. My eyes land on the tilt-a-whirl nearby, and he clocks this. His face lights up. Please, I don't know how much longer I'm here, he asked between yanking my hand towards the ride. Give me this. Just this. Please. It's not that scary. I feel a yank on my hand and I take a step forward. I feel something dart between my legs, and the next thing I know, I'm face planting in the street in the middle of night. I roll over, dazed, and my eyes turn to my savior. Not only 3 feet away was a small gray cat, with specks of black all over him. He had what looked like a slightly torn right ear, and let out what could have been the deepest meow I think I've ever heard from a cat. It sounded like the guy smoked a pack a day. He was thin, but not deathly thin. He either had a neighborhood root of friends to feed him, or was an adept hunter. I heard the honk and instantly got out of the street just in time for a minivan to barrel down the road. I stared dumbfounded, registering the chain of events. I clearly sleptwalk into danger. This is bad. Did Jack lead me here? I felt my head get dizzy. The ball of fur that saved my life rubbed itself on my legs, purring. It snapped me back to reality. I looked down at him, and he looked back at me, expectedly. It was 3 a.m. I was tired. Everything felt heavy, but I looked down at this guy, and I knew not to fight it. I walked back to my place, and sure as a shit, he followed, mewing loudly and what sounded suspiciously cranky at the same time. I walked inside, and he followed instantly. I have a cat now. This is how these things happen. I've heard of the cat distribution system. In the dark of it all, I had a light, and his name was Gravy. He looked like gravy. Your pet name isn't any better. He was healthy as far as I could tell, neutered already, which meant he had experience with people, good or bad. He was skittish, but I knew that was to be expected. It's not my first cat rodeo. I had him set up with the proper kit within the next few days, and his shots scheduled. Curiously, the one spot he reacted the most negatively to was the spot where Jack had died. He got on his haunches and hissed, but let it be. My brain didn't register the possibility as to why until later. Gravy was the thing that kept me going. He gave me a reason. He was just the right mixture of affectionate and cranky aloofness I needed in a cat. I needed Gravy because Jack wouldn't let up. The dreams took a more urgent tone. The first time he returned, I told him of my accident and he swore he didn't do anything. He said that his time was limited. I had to make my decision, because he's getting pulled away somewhere. He claimed. We wouldn't be together unless I left with him before he got pulled. Nobody would love you like me. The noises got more frequent and violent. Gravy saved my sanity during those times. He'd register and clock them too, often reacting with a hiss and a growl and some curiosity. The noises were loud. Plates would shatter against the wall often. I didn't give a damn about setting up cameras to capture it. People would say I'm faking it anyways. The dreams got worse. The color would fade, and Jack would appear with much more urgency each time. Sometimes, his face was slightly off, like his skin was stretched just a little too tight. The smell of his cologne became tinged with dirt and soil. He would exclaim, frightened, how his time was up. He could make it quick. He could help end things painlessly, he promised. I couldn't answer. I later came to realize that if you're asked point blank if you want to die or not, and you can't answer, you don't want to die. He paced in front of me, clearly agitated. This was the first time I've ever seen this version of him angry. It frightened me. I felt myself get warm. You chose a cat over me, he yelled. He took a few aggressive steps forward and grabbed my shoulders. I screamed. His hands burned my shoulders to the touch. He came close to my face and saw bits of bone exposed by his too tight facial skin. His breath made me gag. You will come with me. His jaw unhinged as if to swallow me whole, and I woke up screaming. I didn't startle Gravy, who was watching the side of the room, growling. His fur was up. He hissed at something, but I couldn't see what. I felt a wave of tiredness hit me like a brick, and I fell asleep again. The second I closed my eyes, there's the smell. It's his cologne. I was dreaming. I knew it, but this wasn't like the others. The color was back. Things felt like the way they were supposed to be, not some strange hellscape uncanny valley. I was in a version of our bedroom from our earlier days. Asleep. I was in bed, facing the wall, when I heard the door open. I felt the bed shift, much more weight than it'd be if it were Gravy. I felt fingertips along my back. His touch didn't burn like it did before. It felt ⴚ I got goosebumps. He breathed on the back of my neck and the hairs stood up. He lightly nibbled my ear. I knew in my heart that this wasn't real. I didn't care. I hadn't been touched since Jack. You don't realize how starved you are for touch until you got a plate of food in front of you. I pressed my back against him and I heard him laugh. He rolled on top of me and smiled. He was just as beautiful as the day I met him. He leaned down to kiss with me, such a passion I've never experienced. It took me by surprise how much I needed this moment. Maybe he was right. I felt the pressure in my temples. I felt my lungs begin to struggle as he forced his tongue down my throat. Part of me was screaming to fight back. It was drowned out by just how good it felt to be touched by him. It was comforting. My body began to spasm. I looked Jack in the eyes and saw that his pupils had turned jet black. I felt his tongue begin to swell in my throat as air became harder and harder to acquire. A long, guttural growl cut through the dream like a knife. A hiss. I felt Jack's weight shift. I heard him scream. Instantly, I snapped back awake. I was back in my normal bedroom, awake, still with something on me, but I'm not sure what. I couldn't register or understand what Gravy was doing floating on top of me. He was attacking something, that much was clear. He bit down hard on something, which roared out in pain. Flecks of brown ooze or liquid seemed to splash out of the bite wounds Gravy was inflicting on it. Something connected with my jaw. It felt like a sledgehammer, and I fell off the bed and stumbled back up against the wall. I couldn't process what I was seeing. Gravy was clearly still attached to and attacking something in midair that clearly took up space, but I couldn't see it fully. He growled. I noticed some cuts on Gravy's stomach. Suddenly, Gravy was flung up against the wall, and I felt something cold and very strong grasp my neck and squeeze. Without missing a beat, Gravy was suddenly on the thing again. The grip let up on my neck and I gasped out for air. I heard a yowl, and suddenly Gravy was flung against the wall and held there. He thrashed out but was stuck. Something was holding him. It was squeezing him to death. Whatever holding him was growing more and more visible from the cuts and gashes Gravy had been inflicting on it. Whatever illusions I had faded. Jack was killing my cat, and I was next. I felt a stream of urine go down my leg. I started to get dizzy. In that instant, Gravy made eye contact with me. His face became very strained, focused, and he meowed twice, and that snapped me into action. I thought about it later. I know this sounds crazy, but I know what I heard. Gravy spoke and said 2 words. Not Jack. Fight kicked in. I had little in the way of weapons, till my eyes fell upon a framed photo of Jack and I kept on my nightstand. I lunged for it and bring it down on my nightstand. shattering the glass cover. I grabbed the largest shard without even thinking, not registering the horrible cut I had until later. I lunged for the space between Gravy and me and jabbed the shard of glass into the air. It connects with a wet thud, spurting that same brown liquid into the air. Gravy falls to the ground. More bits of whatever was harassing us slowly begin to take form from the shard of glass until it becomes completely revealed. Whatever fight is in me absolutely flees at the rotting corpse in front of me. Dressed in the rotting clothes I buried Jack in, he growled at me. His dead, black eyes rolled around lifelessly in his skull. My eyes began to water at the smell, and this thing laughed at me, wheezing. It held the shard of glass in its hand, covered in its own ooze, and swiped at me. I held my forearm up just in time to catch the cut. Neither had noticed Gravy reposition himself between us. Completely visible now, the Jack thing lunged at me again. Before it could finish its swing, Gravy was on its throat. The force of the tackle took it by surprise, and it stumbled backward. Gravy tore and gnashed at the thing's throat, coating himself in the same gunk that poured out of it. Its rotting hands grabbed at Gravy to pull him away, but Gravy held strong. I didn't hesitate this time. I tore the shard of glass away from the thing and shoved it down the other side of its throat. Back and forth. I felt the fire burn in my hand from the cuts of holding it tight, but adrenaline kicked in. I didn't care. All I cared about was working on the other side of this monster's neck while my cat got the other. The thing struggled, but we had the upper hand. I hacked away at rotting muscle and flesh until finally I felt it was good enough. I stood up and positioned myself above the thing and grabbed onto its temples. Any resemblance of Jack was gone. It was just a rotting mess of flesh now, roaring in pain. I didn't know if it'd work, but it felt right. I planted my knees on his shoulders and pulled its head away from his body with as much force as I could muster. It didn't require much force at all, and I overcompensated, landing on my butt against my nightstand, the lifeless head of the rotting corpse still in my hands. The thing's body thrashed less and less before it stopped. I held the head in my hands, feeling the activity slowly begin to die inside it too. I felt the familiar fur and purr against my legs as Gravy nuzzled against me. "Good boy," I said. I dropped the head on the ground. I should have been surprised when it slowly turned to ash and began to crumble, but I don't think much would have surprised me anymore. The body slowly followed suit. I eyed Gravy, and then my own hand, and promptly decided on the hospital for both of us. Gravy required multiple stitches. I told the vets he protected me from a wild animal. Technically, I don't think I was wrong. He was bruised and beat up, but must have been a fighter, the vet claimed. She had no idea. I required stitches as well. My hands and forearms were pretty sliced up. I eagerly showed my stitches to Gravy the second I could. I'd like to think there was a bit of camaraderie there. He sniffed them and promptly showed me his butt and took a nap. I slept like a rock the night after. Any sort of physical unwellness was gone. The apartment was quiet, but I couldn't stay. Of course I couldn't. I had to move on. I couldn't hold on hope that there's even a fraction of Jack left. We moved out shortly after. One ghost was enough. Was it even a ghost? Did Gravy know I was in danger? Did he come to me specifically? Did I really hear Gravy speak English to me that night? I Saturday down and asked him. As crazy as it sounded, I sat Gravy on the kitchen table, and I asked him if he said not Jack that night. The air stunk. He farted and hopped off the table. I left it at that. I know I feel safer with him around. This dumb, cranky ball of fur saved my life twice. I did some research after that. I didn't realize that cats essentially domesticated themselves. I had known about how various cultures had cherished them as magical creatures, but pulling themselves out of the food chain by getting domesticated is crazy to me. Unless they did it to protect us from things they can see that we can't, I don't like to think about it. I also don't like to think about the one door in my hallway Gravy always stops to hiss at when we come back from our walks. The neighbor who lives there is a female college student who lives alone, whom I've heard sobbing with surprising intensity often, to the point where I've idly wondered if something was wrong. Something felt wrong. I didn't want to admit it. I don't like to think about the rapid, familiar thumping I hear from her apartment sometimes. I don't like to think about this time Gravy stopped at the door and look up at me to ask me with his eyes. "Hey, we doing this or what?" I took a step away from the door, but Gravy held firm. I eyed him. Nobody will believe me, but this sly bastard nodded at me. I took a deep breath, rolled my eyes, and knocked. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Crazy title, right? It sounds crazy. Well, that's because it is crazy. Am I crazy? Am I okay? I'm a very skeptical guy. But looking back at this, there's so much I could have done to avoid this. But I've learned my lesson, and now I'm a believer. Feel free to comment what you think, because I honestly don't know. I'm just going to tell you what happened. Okay. So these thoughts were not what I was expecting to have after a weekend of camping with my two friends. We camp a lot. We like to rural camp and hike through these hills. In the middle of nowhere, we got a train to a nearby town and then just set off with our supplies. After walking all day, we saw this dark forest miles off on top of this hill, and it was getting late. So we set off intending to stay there as long as we needed to. We arrived around 7:30 p.m. and dropped our large packs full of gear in 광 and just Saturday there. This was a dark forest with trees surrounding us, with big, thick, dark leaves. It looked like evening at day, and God knows how dark at night we were on. A hill with the nearest small town hours away. We had no call center, no help, no roads, cars, nothing. This was rural camping, a time to appreciate nature. We were sitting at the top of the hill. It was flat here. The ground was brown with sticks and dirt, with chunks of wood. Everywhere. There was one pathway leading downhill to another flat area. Anything off this path was uneven. Dangerous ground. We set up one 3-man tent and a small stove and ate some food and slept. The next day is the first full day we spent there. And when I first noticed something strange about this place, because we woke up to no sound, absolutely nothing. Like dead immediately. I think there may be a predator nearby, but there's nothing. It felt like headphones, literally a crazy silence. After we ate, we went out to find some rocks to make a fire for fun. And as we went down the path down the hill, there was a small worn ball. Now we had not seen or heard anyone since we set off. We were in the middle of nowhere, but we thought nothing of it and played with it for a while and headed back up the path. As we did, one friend dropped the ball. It rolled down this path and off the side, going downhill fast. We went after it. All we could hear was this ball rolling over wood until we heard a thump as it went off this small cliff and dropped into a clearing. It hit a tree with hanging nooses all over it. We hadn't gone this far to one side before, and we had never seen this tree. It was big and wide, but rotted with holes in it, and hanging from it was downscions of worn moss-covered nooses. We were definitely shook, but what could we do? Except get the ball and go back as Mike goes to retrieve it. Remember seeing him go out of sight round this tree, and he shouted us over behind. This tree was a dead sheep. It was a very strange sight because it was fully intact with no smell at all, but it looked fresh and recent. There was just a single hole pressed into it. No blood, no fur, no sign of struggle at this point, I thought. How did a sheep get here? Because there were no farms anywhere. It was like someone had just placed this here. I remember feeling watched. Whipped my head round, all I could see was trees forever. We ultimately thought it must have been foxes, and finally headed back to camp and slept. The second day was the last day we spent there, and for most of it, we were up and down the path collecting wood for another big fire. My other third friend ate with us and went to the camp to sleep, but me and Mike and played with the ball some more until around 7 p.m. And again, we headed back up the same path until way off in the distance, Mike saw something and stopped. I turn around and look in the same direction. Something red was on a tree. We had been up this path and never was there any color in the distance, just gray and brown trees forever. We went to check it out as it got darker, and later, there was a red circle with dots and lines stained into this tree. Beneath it was a circle of feathers, and behind it bone skulls of dog or some kind of smaller animal scattered everywhere. It started raining, and at this point, we got lost. There was that feeling again this time, way more intense. Something was watching me. I felt it. I knew it. Hairs standing up. Absolute terror. Me and Mike started sprinting. I heard branches breaking, and I swore. I glanced back and saw something tall, just moving after us. moving weirdly, and snapping branches. We finally saw the path barely illuminated by some moonlight. And then, absolute silence. I looked back. There was nothing, just rain. As we ran up the path and jumped into our tent, we looked at each other in shock. We knew someone was out here. Our other friend lay asleep. We never spoke, just a silent agreement to sleep. All I remember is us waking up, packing up, and getting TF out of there the next morning. Now everything after me sleeping is Mike's account that he told me that next morning. Mike woke up feeling absolute dread. He's the only one awake. He said he heard a snapping sound outside the tent. But far away as he heard this, I suddenly sit up, eyes bulging. Apparently I started rambling about God, saying, curse Catholic families, and something about natives and just vulgar language. Waking my other friend, they decided to open the tent and have me get some air. When I started digging and scratching myself, they put me back inside when I fell asleep immediately. When telling me this, I immediately doubted it, trying to laugh it off. But as we hiked back to the nearest town, he was dead serious. So was the third friend. I felt embarrassed by my behavior. It felt like you're in trouble. But you have done nothing, only I knew I did deep down. We don't quite know what happened that weekend, but something strange happened to me that night, and I'm lucky I snapped out of it. I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and though housing prices weren't as bad as they are now, it was still a pricey county. After months of asking around, I was connected with Anders, an elderly man who was leasing a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house in North Hollywood for far below market rate. The catch, because there's always a catch when it comes to affordable housing, was that the house had been terribly maintained. It had been unoccupied for a year and would need some serious TLC before most people could comfortably reside in it. I, however, had been living out of a car for 4 years. As long as the place had running water, it would be an upgrade for me. I moved into the house in fall 2012. Anders gave me a tour before I got settled. He was a short, joyful old man, well-meaning, but how do I put this? Maybe not the most focused as a result of his age. At one point during the tour, he showed me the bathroom, then the master bedroom, then the bathroom again, then the master bedroom again. He was about to walk into the bathroom for a third time before I gently guided him down the hall. The house itself was livable but weathered. Dim lighting from outdated fixtures cast long shadows over peeling wallpaper. The ceiling in many of the rooms was discolored from past leaks. The faucet in the kitchen sink was broken. The bathtub was badly chipped, and a few of the cabinet handles fell off in my hand. It was a rundown place, located in a bars on the window kind of neighborhood. But still, it was my place. I was smiling ear to ear when Anders gave me the keys. It's a good house with good bones. You take care of it. Now, he instructed, which I found ironic. Before he left, he paused in the front doorway, drawing a hand to his chin as he looked behind me into the house. I tried to follow his gaze, but couldn't figure out what he was looking at. Everything all right? Yes, just that something looks different about that bathroom, though I can't put my finger on what. Ah well, it's a good house with good bones. You take care of it. Now. And with that, he gave me a nod and left me to my unpacking. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed living in a house. I didn't care how rundown the place was. Just having an accessible bathroom and a full-size mattress to sleep on made me feel like a king. After I'd spent a few days cleaning the place up, I invited my sister and her fiancé over for dinner. I'm sure it sounds stupid, but my newly acquired ability to host company made me proud. In no time at all, I'd comfortably settled into my new home. That evening, after saying goodbye to my guests, I took a shower. The bathroom lacked a traditional, above-the-sink mirror. Instead, it had a wide, full-length mirror mounted on the wall to the left of the vanity. When I exited the shower and stepped up to the glass, raising a hand to wipe away the fog, I noticed something odd. In the condensation, right at my eye level, was the word "hi." I didn't know what to make of it. Somehow, the letters seemed intentional. It was hard to pass off as simply the way the steam had settled. My sister had been in the bathroom just before she left. Maybe she had written the word on the mirror with her fingertip, and the steam had only made the letters visible after my shower. I almost texted her about it, but the message seemed ridiculous when I typed it out. Paranoid, even, I wiped the mirror down and turned in for the night, and soon I forgot about it entirely. The following week, I received a promotion at one of my jobs, and while I was grateful for the additional income, my new position meant longer days. Additionally, I realized that a few of the house repairs were beyond my ability, and so I started outsourcing some work to contractors. It was annoying to only have the house to myself at night, but I didn't have another option with my busy schedule. Things were generally progressing smoothly, though every once in a while, in the middle of the night, I would be awoken by a sound that I couldn't quite place. When I next noticed writing on my mirror, I had been living at the house for a month. The second sighting occurred in much the same way as the first. I came back home after work and took a shower. When I pushed back the shower curtain, I looked at the glass and saw, written in the condensation, the words, "Staying long?" Now, I could pass 2 letters off as a coincidence, but 2 words? An entire question? That was no coincidence. Someone had been in my bathroom. And recently, I had contractors in and out of my house all the time, so one of them could have written the message. But why? I got dressed and put a hand on the bathroom doorknob, about to go back into my bedroom, when it occurred to me that whoever had written the message might still be around. I slowly cracked open the door, peering down the dark hallway in one direction, then the other. I listened very carefully, but heard nothing. I walked around my house, which didn't take long given its size, and looked for anything out of place. All of my doors were locked, all of my windows were shut, and none of my personal items had been disturbed. If someone had broken into my house, they were long gone by the time I looked around. That second message put me on edge for days. I triple-checked that my windows and doors were locked each night. I looked in every potential hiding spot, of which there were few in my little house, after I came home from work and before I went to sleep. And yet, though I was certain that my house was secure, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. A month passed without incident. I had almost started to feel at home in my new lodgings again until, one Friday morning, I awoke just past 3 a.m. I couldn't immediately tell what had woken me. Often, the house settled at night, creaking and groaning in ways that made it sound alive. But in that moment, the house was silent. It was only after I turned my head to the side did I realize that my bedroom door, which I was certain I had shut, was wide open. I stared down the hallway, feeling as though I were gazing into a black hole. The darkness was abyssal. I kept waiting for my eyes to adjust, waiting for them to pick out the familiar shapes of my home, but they never did. I couldn't see a thing, so why did I feel like something could see me? Like there was something in the house with me, just feet beyond the threshold to my bedroom, watching, waiting. Somehow, I found the courage to rise from my bed and walk toward the door. When I made it to the handle, I grabbed it and slammed the door shut. I didn't investigate further, didn't so much as stick my head out into the hall for a closer look. My bedroom door didn't have a lock. None of the doors except the bathroom did. So I dragged my bookcase in front of the door. It was a small bookcase, and an intruder could probably ram the door open anyway if they wanted to, but not before the sound alerted me. When morning came and I had to leave the house for work, I genuinely considered exiting my house through the window. I was almost late by the time I worked up the nerve myself to look around my house before I left. As always, I found nothing amiss. After work, when I reluctantly returned home for the night, I ate a quick dinner and hopped in the shower. I remember standing in the tub for a long time, mulling over my predicament. I'd heard horror stories about people secretly living in other people's homes. Maybe I had become a victim of a fraud without even knowing. But if that was the case, then where the hell were they? There was nowhere to hide in that tiny house. I'd torn the place apart multiple times by then, checking every cabinet and closet. The inside of the house couldn't be accessed from the crawl space, and the air vents were too small for a person to fit in. Suddenly, I heard a click, so tiny that I'd almost missed it entirely. I tore back the shower curtain, gripping the shampoo bottle like I was about to bludgeon an intruder to death with it. As I'd come to expect, there was no one in the shower, but there was a new message on the mirror. This one was bold, the easiest to read of any of the messages I'd received so far. It was 3 words long. I see you. Some awful amalgam of fear, confusion, and anger made my stomach churn. Ultimately, the latter emotion rose above the rest. I hastily dried off and threw on some clothes, then grabbed my phone from where I'd left it on the bathroom counter. I punched in Anders's number and glared at that damn mirror as I listened to the phone ring again and again. I'd started to think it was too late for him to be awake when he suddenly picked up. He started to ask me how I was faring in my new lodgings before I cut him off. I need you to tell me if there's some way that a person could be getting into the house. I said, every night. I check every window and door. I check every cupboard, closet, and cabinet, and still things are amiss. You need to let me know if there's some entry point that I'm not aware of. Anders didn't seem to entirely understand what I was asking. What? What's getting in? You let me know if you're having rat troubles. My last tenant before you had rat troubles sometimes. Yeah, sure. I've got rats. Besides the doors and the windows. How could they be getting in? Well, there's the vents, of course. And there was a chimney once, though we had it sealed up a good long while ago. And there's also the crawl space. Of course, though I'm sure you've already poked around down there. Though I knew the home had a crawl space, I'd never had much reason to investigate it. I was never able to find the entrance, even after ripping up all the carpeting in the house, likely. Hardwood had been installed over the access door, making it an unlikely point of entry for an intruder. How do I get down to the crawl space? Yes, you should give the crawl space a gander. I turned 18 in 2008, and on the day of my birthday, for reasons I won't bore you with, I packed up my things and moved out. For 4 years, I lived in my car, working as a barista from 6 to 2 and as a line cook from 4 to 10. My plan was to work until I had enough money for my own place, and then to either go to college or get a real job. Looking back on it now, I don't know how I did it. But by 22, I'd saved up a decent sum of money and began my hunt for a semi-permanent place of residence. I barely stopped myself from smashing the phone into the counter. I planned to. Where can I find the entrance? That'll be on the floor of the bathroom closet. I looked around the room. Surely, I'd misheard him. Either that or he was confused again. What? I know it's an odd place for it, but it's only there because that room didn't always used to be a bathroom. The bathroom doesn't have a closet. Sure it does, just to the left of the vanity. I looked at the mirror, at that long, oversized mirror. I'd always found it odd, for a bathroom of that size, to have a built-in floor-to-ceiling mirror. What was it that Anders had said when he'd first visited? That something had looked different about the bathroom? Setting my phone down next to the sink, I stepped up close to the glass. I spent a few moments feeling around the frame, looking for a latch. Then I grabbed a portion of the right side of the frame in 2 hands. After one hard yank, the mirror swung open like a door, revealing a large walk-in closet. Anders was saying something on the other end of the line, but I was too stunned to answer. There was a square-shaped hole at the back of the closet, which I assumed led down to the crawl space beneath the house. The closet floor was littered with all kinds of trash, filthy sheets, fast food containers, beer cans, and I realized some of my own items. Little things I thought I'd misplaced. A sock, a toothbrush, a comb, and a small, framed photograph of me, my sister, and our old family dog. I crouched down to pick up the photo, perched in the doorway as I studied my younger, smiling self. I heard Anders saying my name over the phone, except the voice didn't sound much like Anders at all. It was too deep, too clear, too close. When I looked up, a man was peeking out at me from the hole in the floor. He smiled at me, his eyes wide and pupils blown. His smile so wide it looked painful, and his hair long and matted. He was only visible from the neck up, and the harsh lighting made it look like a disembodied head was grinning at me from the back of the closet. Horrified, I rose to my feet and ran. I didn't stop running until I made it to my car, which I promptly drove to my sister's house. The next day, I drove to the police station to file a report. An officer met me at the house to check the scene, and I showed him the hidden closet, which indeed had an entrance to the crawl space. My best guess was that the intruder was entering my crawl space from the small door on the side of my house. He'd likely been squatting in the house during the year in which it sat unoccupied, and when he saw it was being prepared for sale, he had disguised the closet door so as to keep a little room for himself. Why he decided to stay, or why he was leaving me messages, I can't say. From his actions, and from what little I saw of him, I think it's safe to assume that he wasn't of sound mind. Unfortunately, the man was never found. For all I know, he's still in that same neighborhood. Hell, he might even be in the same house. I moved across the county afterwards and have lived in studio apartments ever since. The thought of living in a big house with all those rooms and corners and places to hide gives me the creeps. It's not just houses that the incident soured for me, but mirrors as well. These days, when I visit a friend or stay at a hotel, I always have to carefully inspect the bathroom mirrors, shining a light directly into their faces and tapping a finger against the glass, because the worst detail of the whole ordeal was that, when revisiting the bathroom with the police officer, I stepped into the old closet, closed the door, and looked into the mirror. Instead of my reflection, I saw the officer's face on the other side of the glass. Louis and I were identical in nearly every way. We shared the same sandy hair, the same piercing blue eyes, and even the same mischievous grin that drove our parents up the wall. Growing up, we were two halves of a whole, our lives so intertwined that it was impossible to imagine one of us without the other. We did everything together, whether it was exploring the woods behind our house, playing endless games of basketball in the driveway, or staying up late into the night whispering secrets and dreams. We were inseparable. Even our friends and teachers struggled to tell us apart, and we loved to play pranks, swapping places and watching the confusion unfold. Our bond was more than just physical. It was almost telepathic. We had our own language of glances and gestures, a silent communication that only we understood. It was comforting, knowing that no matter what happened, we had each other. But we weren't just best friends. We were rivals too. There was always a healthy competition between us, whether it was for better grades, faster race times, or who could tell the best joke. Louis had a natural charm that drew people in, while I was more introspective, preferring to observe and think before acting. Yet, despite our differences, we complemented each other perfectly. As we got older, our interests began to diverge. Louis became passionate about music, spending hours in his room practicing guitar, while I threw myself into sports, determined to make the varsity basketball team. Still, our bond remained unshaken, and we always found time for our shared adventures. One of our favorite traditions was the annual summer camping trip with our dad. Every year, we would pack up the car and head to the same remote campsite, far away from the noise and distractions of everyday life. Those trips were magical, filled with late-night ghost stories around the campfire, fishing in the clear, cool lake, and hiking through the dense forest trails. It was during one of these trips that we discovered an old, abandoned cabin deep in the woods. The place was a wreck, with broken windows and a collapsing roof. But to us, it was a treasure trove of possibilities. We spent hours exploring, pretending it was our secret hideout, a place where we could escape from the world and be whoever we wanted to be. As the years passed, the cabin became our sanctuary. Whenever life got too overwhelming, we would sneak away, escaping to our secret refuge. It was there that we had some of our deepest conversations, sharing our hopes, fears, and dreams for the future. But everything changed on that cold December night. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, filled with warmth and laughter. We had just finished decorating the Christmas tree, a tradition that always brought our family together. The house was filled with the scent of pine and cinnamon, the soft glow of fairy lights casting a cozy ambiance. Louis and I had been arguing earlier that day about something trivial: who got to put the star on top of the tree. It was a silly, childish argument, but it left a lingering tension between us. We barely spoke during dinner, each of us nursing our bruised egos. The fire started in the basement, in the room where our father kept his woodworking tools. We didn't notice it at first, too engrossed in our own worlds. It wasn't until the smoke alarm went off that we realized something was wrong. My father sprang into action, shouting for us to get out. The smoke was thick, filling the house with a choking haze. Louis and I were upstairs, and as we tried to make our way down, the flames erupted, blocking our path. Panic set in, the reality of the situation hitting us hard. My father reached me first, his strong arms pulling me through the smoke and flames. I screamed for Louis, but my voice was drowned out by the roaring fire. I caught a glimpse of him at the top of the stairs, his eyes wide with fear, our gazes locked for what felt like an eternity. And then he was gone, swallowed by the inferno. The fire department arrived too late. Our house, once a place of warmth and love, was reduced to ashes. And Louis, my other half, was gone forever. The grief that followed was indescribable, a constant ache that settled in my chest and refused to leave. My mother fell into a deep depression, her vibrant spirit extinguished. She would sit for hours, staring at old photographs of Louis, her tears flowing freely. My father threw himself into his work, using it as a distraction from the unbearable pain. As for me, I was lost, wandering through life like a shadow of my former self. For a while, it seemed like life might return to some semblance of normalcy. But then, strange things started happening. It began with small, almost insignificant occurrences: flickering lights, unexplained hotspots in the house, the smell of smoke with no apparent source. At first, we dismissed them as coincidences, but the incidents became more frequent and more terrifying. The first real tragedy struck about a year after the fire. My mother was alone at home, lighting a candle in Louis's memory, something she did every day. According to the fire report, it was a freak accident. The candle tipped over, igniting the curtains. By the time the fire department arrived, the house was engulfed in flames. My mother didn't make it out. Her death shattered us. My father and I were consumed by grief, barely able to function. We moved into a small apartment, hoping for a fresh start, but the fires followed us. Next was my father. He was a careful man, meticulous in his habits. But one night, as he was working late in his home office, the apartment building caught fire. The cause was never determined. My father died trying to save the other tenants. I was alone, the last surviving member of my family. The fear and paranoia became my constant companions. I was convinced that Louis's spirit was behind the fires, seeking vengeance for his untimely death. The thought of my twin brother, once my closest friend, turned into a vengeful spirit was almost too much to bear. I tried to escape, moving from place to place, never staying in one spot for too long. But no matter where I went, the fires followed. I started seeing Louis everywhere, in reflections, in dreams, in the flickering shadows of candlelight. His presence was a constant reminder of the past, a haunting specter that refused to let me go. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom filled with smoke. The fire alarm blared, and flames licked at the walls. I stumbled out of bed, coughing and disoriented. But there was no way out. The door was blocked by fire, and the windows were sealed shut. I was trapped. That's when I saw him, Louis, standing in the midst of the flames. His eyes filled with sorrow and rage. He didn't speak, but I felt his anger, his pain. I knew then that I had to confront him, to find a way to make amends. "Louis," I whispered, my voice choked with smoke and fear. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." His expression softened, the flames around him flickering and dimming. For a moment, it seemed like he might forgive me, but then his face twisted in pain, and the flames roared back to life. I knew I had to do more. "I should have saved you," I cried, tears streaming down my face. "It should have been me. I miss you every day. Louis, please, let me make this right." The flames around us seemed to waver, and Louis stepped closer. I could see the pain in his eyes, the torment that had consumed him. I reached out, my hand passing through the flames, and touched his ghostly form. In that moment, a wave of memories washed over me. Our childhood, the laughter, the shared dreams. I felt his pain, his anger, but also his love. The connection we had as twins, stronger than anything, was still there, buried beneath the anger and sorrow. "I love you, Louis," I whispered. "I always have. Please, let go of the anger. Let go of the pain." His eyes met mine, and for the first time since the fire, I saw a flicker of recognition, of the brother I had lost. The flames around us began to fade, the heat dissipating. Louis's form grew faint, the anger in his eyes replaced by a deep, abiding sadness. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to hurt you." Tears blurred my vision, and I nodded, unable to speak. In that moment, I felt a profound sense of peace, a release from the torment that had plagued us both. Louis's form faded, the last remnants of the fire extinguishing with him. The room was silent, the air clear. I was alone, but I felt a sense of closure, a peace that had eluded me for so long. I knew that Louis had finally found rest, and that I could begin to heal. The days that followed were difficult, filled with grief and memories. But I no longer felt the oppressive presence of my brother's spirit. The fires had stopped, and for the first time since that tragic night, I felt a glimmer of hope. I still think of Louis every day,